To say that Canada is in debt would be a massive understatement. The Great White North is drowning in debt, and if something's not done soon, it's going to sink into the icy waters below the weight of its staggering $10 trillion debt. In this video, we're taking a look at Canada's debt bubble crisis and what it means for regular people. How did things get this bad, and what can be done about it? Let's dive in, but first, a warning. This cold plunge isn't going to be pleasant, and it may shock what you thought you knew about Canada. However, one thing is for certain, this video will wake you up. With Ottawa announcing a $40 billion deficit this year and its plan to spend around $21 billion more than expected in the next 6 years, Canada's spending is absolutely out of control. So how did Canada get here? How did we get stuck in the worst debt bubble in Canadian history? A lot of this huge overspending and debt crisis goes back to the former far left-wing Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who ran gargantuan deficits and printed money to pay for it. Growing the liberal welfare state to unprecedented levels, Trudeau promised a great life for everyone, and the lapdog media played along. Pierre Trudeau's utopia didn't arrive, at least not to anybody living outside of an ivory tower. Instead, he steadily undermined and attacked Canada's energy sector, angered Western Canada with his hostility, and put in a number of failed and wasteful big government programs. He suspended Canada's constitution to deal with a hostage crisis from Quebec separatists and drove the economy into the ground with stagflation, meaning high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. This is an economist's worst nightmare and Trudeau's senior real legacy. Instead of great times, Canada's inflation and unemployment rate both climbed to 12% between 1980 to 1983, while interest rates soared to 19%. Where's that utopia? It seemed like Trudeau Sr. was trying to imitate his friend Fidel Castro's communist Cuba, not lead a free market Western nation. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and successive liberal and some conservative governments have continued Trudeau Sr.'s high deficit spending patterns. But there is no doubt that it got worse than ever under Trudeau's son, current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, whose reckless liberal government has run an ever-growing deficit every year since it was elected in 2015. Canada's household, corporate, and government debt now adds up to a whopping $10.2 trillion, which amounts to $255,000 per person. That's more than 3 times higher than Canada's GDP. It's worse than Greece's 2009 debt crisis that led to mass austerity, protests, and suicides. It's higher than 45 of 48 of the biggest debt crises that have occurred around the world in the past 100 years. Interest rates have been kept relatively low the past several decades despite its recent climb to 5%. But if Canada's interest rates go up to the historical average of 7.6% over the past 61 years, Canada would owe $294 billion a year just on interest payments. That's about what the country spends on healthcare every year just to pay off interest. This calling in of debts to the sunken Canadian economy will happen eventually and make today's problems look like child's play. When then Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and Finance Minister Paul Martin slashed the federal civil service by 45,000 jobs in the 1990s and cut $7 billion annually from federal funding for healthcare, education, and social services, real people suffered. Folks died from not getting seen at hospitals, with austerity programs put in by the Mulroney and Kim Campbell governments only worsening things. In every case where debt crises have occurred and austerity cutbacks have resulted, suicide rates have spiked and despair has become the norm. As deficit spending soared during COVID and inflation grew, Canada is now in the midst of a homelessness, addiction, inflation, and housing crisis that's one of the worst it's ever had. The economy is also creaking under record household debt as Canadian families struggle to put food on the table and be able to afford basic necessities like heating and gas for their vehicle. Some poor Canadians are even choosing to contact Canada's state euthanasia program, Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAID, instead of continuing to live in poverty. Welcome to Justin Trudeau's bright, cheery Canada. But don't think Trudeau's losing sleep. He's already made it clear that bringing in 500,000 new immigrants to Canada each year is his priority, not the Canadians who need somewhere to live. Canadian households have more debt than any other G7 country and now owe more than the value of the whole Canadian economy. Canada's in much worse shape than where the US was before the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis and resulting economic recession. In fact, Canadian household debt now sits at 107% of Canada's GDP. In 2008, household debt in Canada was 80% of GDP, before rising to 95% by 2010 and surpassing 100% during the pandemic. Meanwhile, U.S. household debt fell from 100% of GDP in 2008 to 75% by 2021 and is currently around 64% of GDP. The vastly higher cost of carrying a mortgage is a major risk to the economy in the coming years. The central bank has raised its lending rate in an attempt to bring down record-high inflation, and variable-rate mortgage holders have felt the pinch of higher rates immediately. But the central bank warned that fixed-rate holders should brace for a similar impact when they renew in the coming years. Rent prices are also soaring, and not only in Toronto and Vancouver. While many families struggle to stay afloat in record debt while their income level stays the same, the economy as a whole suffers. Consumer debt and national debt are both spiking out of control. Adjusted for current inflation, Canada's total provincial and federal debt from its public spending increased from $1.1 trillion to $2.1 trillion between 2007 to 2022, according to a study by the Fraser Institute think tank. That's a sizable chunk of Canada's total $10.2 trillion. Where's that government money going? It's going to employment insurance, education, healthcare, and more, including postal services and ferry services. It's going to cultural funding grants and subsidies. According to the 2021 federal spending report, there was $158 billion spent that year on social benefits, $135 billion in grants, around $29 billion in subsidies, around $24 billion in interest payments on existing debt, and around $127 billion on goods and services, employee payments, and miscellaneous expenses. That's a whole lot more debt racking up every year, and even more interest owing each year on the principal sum. The federal government's growing debt load will keep growing in the years ahead and eat up more and more of Ottawa's spending. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's recent economic statement even admits that Canada's growth is going to freeze, with unemployment projected to go up at least 1% in 2024. The government says it doesn't expect to post a balanced budget for the foreseeable future, and it's likely to be an even darker outlook than that, with a recession on the way for Canada. The Liberals plan to spend nearly $70 billion more between now and 2028, with $59.5 billion rolling out over the next 5 years. But you don't spend yourself out of a recession, especially with the low productivity and competition that's currently plaguing Canada's economy and industry. Just drive through a tent city or take a stroll through the grocery store to see the impact of Canada's debt bubble. Worries over income stagnation and lack of wage growth, along with rising prices and a reckless government that doesn't care about Canadians, is making the situation worse. People can't afford the prices for basic necessities, while their personal well-being and optimism also suffers. What is there to look forward to when you're facing down a housing shortage, spiking prices, and an oncoming recession that the country isn't prepared for at all? As David Rosenberg, economist and president of Rosenberg Research, recently said, "We are already in a recession, and the Bank of Canada is busy fighting yesterday's battle, which is the inflation that's in the rearview mirror." Looking ahead at a potential recession and rising unemployment, Canada's debt bubble continues to loom. It's the elephant nobody in the room is talking about, or at least not nearly enough. While Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre recently brought attention to Canada's debt crisis by posting a documentary called Detonation on the social media platform X, he didn't say a whole lot about what his actual plan would be to reverse Canada's urgent situation and ensure the huge debts don't get called into play at historically higher interest rates. Identifying in the problem is one thing, and it's very important, but solving it is another. The unfortunate reality is that Canada's administrative state, or deep state as it's called by former U.S. President Donald Trump, along with its liberal big spending ideology, has backed Canada into a corner. The result of all this reckless spending and the debt-to-recession cycle is clear. More government power, more dependency of the people on the government, more devaluation of the currency, and less respect for basic rights and freedoms. We already saw Justin Trudeau freeze Canadians' bank accounts during the pandemic for speaking out against him. What would he and his cabinet do in a future where they hold even more power and have Canadians even more dependent on out-of-control government spending? As Max Nemney and Monique Nemney explain in their authoritative 2006 biography, Young Trudeau, Justin's father Pierre Trudeau became liberal as a young man after traveling around communist China and being inspired by their massive infrastructure growth and unity. His left-wing beliefs were then reinforced during his further education at Harvard, a college whose president Claudine Gay is now under fire for serious plagiarism, and which is having ties cut by other universities for alleged anti-Semitism. Trudeau Sr.'s infatuation with communist China wasn't a one-off. It's a system his son Justin Trudeau has also praised. surprised, noting in the past that he has a level of admiration for China's basic dictatorship. Is this Trudeau's plan for Canada? Is this what's going to happen when the debt bubble bursts once and for all? If you like this video and want to learn more about what's really going on in Canada, check out this video here. And if this video brought value to you today, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video. Thanks for watching.